I'd like to introduce Adele Horin. And Adele really does have the must-read blog if you're interested in anything related to ageing. And that blog is called The Coming of Age. So I would recommend that to you. The links are there on the introduction.
The reforms that Kevin Rudd initiated through the road home were quite significant, and it was great that it got the attention at the time. I do think that there has been some positive results. There has been an increase. There was some capital building of some permanent supportive housing options. There was a range of different projects, the National Partnership Against Homelessness, the programs that were again extended for 1 year, so we still have to fight that fight again this year. Those projects have been quite successful in getting some people into permanent housing and supporting them. I guess the problem is, and I get this, there wasn't systemic change, and without systemic change any number of projects can be well meant and funded and help some people, but there was no change to the way in which we think about homelessness, the way in which we think about housing. We saw that from Ben and Raphael and the other speakers, that in fact we've got some serious systemic problems that were simply not addressed. And I might just add the other thing that was introduced at the time, the National Rental Affordability Scheme, was the only kind of subsidising of any kind of affordable housing capital projects, and that a few weeks ago with the federal budget was completely axed. And so, I mean, we have seen from the current government absolutely no commitment to addressing this issue.
Is there anything you want to add, Ben?
Yeah, I might just briefly. So, with those numbers I put up before, there was a column for public housing or social housing, which you'll notice was also declining. All of that injection of funds briefly stalled that decline. That's all it did. So it didn't start bringing it back up again, it just stopped it declining briefly. And that was an enormous injection of funds that required quite a lot of political will. And that shows the scale of this problem. Because housing is a capital asset, to try and get any stock of housing at all is really, really, really expensive. So if you want to try and reverse any of the things I was talking about, like by the time we're, 20 years, we're talking trillions of dollars would be needed in injections to be able to do that. It's also why the tax concessions for housing are so monumentally large. They're about $40 billion a year at the moment, goes in tax concessions to people who are buying housing. And that's the real big money, much bigger than the amount put in by Rudd. And that was the structural change, the systemic change I think Felicity's talking about. So while you left the $40 billion of tax concessions in there, and you're trying to make up the difference with much smaller amounts of money for much shorter periods of time, look, you can kind of stall the inevitable, but you're not going to solve the problem.
I could ask lots of questions, but I wonder, I'd like to turn to the audience, and do we have a microphone?
I actually liaise and network with a group that has the money but cannot find the buildings to buy for homelessness. And
talk to me.
I need your name and number immediately.
Fantastic. Okay. No, I would really, because they're looking for properties, and they're ending up buying old pubs in the city here and turning them into places where people can live. So I asked the question, who makes the decision when they knock down a building like the old North Shore Hospital that I believe could have housed so many people without it being a ghetto or anything, but they just knocked that beautiful huge building that was I couldn't see any structural problems with it. So who makes that decision?
I seriously do want to talk to you. Look, I think that we've got a mixture of people making decisions, and I think it is, as I said earlier, up to us to come up with a range of projects, and it needs as many organisations and people trying to do that. I know one of the issues, because we were involved in advocating very strongly for a permanent supportive housing model called Common Ground, which is a mixed tenancy model. I greatly believe in mixed tenancies. I don't think you'll get anything other than problems if you put a whole lot of people with problems all in one building. And so you do need a range of models. I know one of the issues, because we were looking at the redevelopment of a building that was unused in the inner city, because it's kind of based on that concept, that it was actually ended up being more expensive to redevelop an old building than it was to build a brand new building. And so sometimes it can be more expensive to actually do that. Nonetheless, we need to talk.
I would like to make a comment, and I'm not sure how many people are aware that at the moment the state government has a select committee into affordable housing, and there is a public hearing on Friday. It was initiated by Greens MLC Jan Barham in conjunction with Sophie Kotsis of the ALP, a very good example of cross-party work. And I think some of the revealing things that I'm finding, having been watching the situation at a place called Ivanhoe Estate near Macquarie University for the past 2 years, is the serious involvement of the development lobby in trying to get people who are currently in affordable social housing out of that housing to be demolished for high-rise development in Ryde, in all sorts of places. So when we say who makes the decisions, I think the decisions are actually being made by people who have certainly not altruistic concerns about their fellow man and woman, but are basically out to line their own pockets. And I think we're very fortunate to have an ICAC in this country and in this state, and I hope to goodness we fight for its maintenance. But anyone who is interested, the select committee is made up of a member from each of the parties. It's chaired by a Christian Democrat, Sophie Kotsis, Jan Barham, Greg Pearce, who was actually very instrumental in initiating the loss of social housing, but has now seemingly had a road to Damascus experience, and is on that committee as a member of the Liberal Party, and there is also a national. So it's a very interesting experience. I went to the first hearing and sat there all day observing, and it's really great to see 5 politicians from 5 different parties looking at a problem, not screaming at each other across the House, not taking an adversarial party political position, but actually looking at a problem and trying to solve the problem. And I think we as citizens of this country have to demand that more of that happens. And I'd like to thank everybody here. I have to say, Heidi, I had a very strong deja vu experience. I was an industry advisor in affirmative action in the 80s, and everything you said, I felt we've done it all before. And what we need to ask, and you may like to answer this, all of you, why is it in this country we have such an incredible resistance to the notion of women having an equal role in every field of our endeavours?
Perhaps we'll get Heidi to address that, because I would have added, is education. I feel a bit the same as the speaker, reporting on these issues for 20 or more years, and hearing more about education, persuasion, and data. And I keep thinking, we've done that for 2 decades. Or what do you think, Heidi?
Wow, I feel solely responsible at the moment for changing gender equality nationally. Thank you for your comments. So many really interesting points that you've made there. When I talk to different people, both men and women, and from lots of different age groups, I often hear similar things. And I guess from a personal perspective, I do feel like we can make a difference, which is why I've decided to work for the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. But I certainly think that we have to look at, continue to research what the barriers are and why, not just structural barriers, but really the cultural barriers, and understand what it is about our Australian culture that means we continue to think of gender roles in a certain way, and then also looking at the individual issues and how we can, as individuals, play a role in this. from the agency's perspective, and certainly from my role as the head of education and innovation, I personally think we need to think about how we tackle this problem differently. And the point you've alluded to, which is that we all need to work together. The way we think of this at the agency is we've mapped the gender equality ecosystem. So we don't see ourselves as being the single body responsible for shaping gender equality in this workplace, in this country. We see all of the different players, the Australian Human Rights Commission, research institutions like Macquarie University and the UNSW, groups like Economic Security for Women, certainly working with various ministers and politicians, working with business, working with leading companies like Westpac. We each have to look at this very, very complex issue, not just see it as a women's issue, it's actually a societal issue. It's a workplace issue as well. It's how we conceive of the notion of work. It's how we conceive of the notion of what leadership is, what the ideal worker is. The work organisational model that we have is from an industrial age. It doesn't necessarily reflect the knowledge economy that we're in, or the sorts of structures that will be required for a much more liquid and complex business world. So I'm sort of rambling, but it is a much more complex issue. It's a social issue. It's an organisational issue. It's a structural issue in our economy. So the way we need to tackle the problem is to bring all of these different groups together and really understand what the levers are and who is responsible for dealing with which levers.
Question, also a comment, I suppose. When we talk about workplace, we're actually in a workplace here. We ask why. Okay, yeah, better. We're in a workplace here, the New South Wales Parliament, and we wonder why we don't get systemic change. I'm just trying to read the figures correctly here. We only have, in New South Wales Parliament, 23.7% of the MPs are female. We have the second lowest representation of women MPs across the country. I mean, even the Northern Territory beats in New South Wales. I mean, I think that's... So when we talk about why we don't get systemic change and why some of these issues aren't taken seriously, that's why they're not, because we don't actually have the women in the parliaments, in the positions to actually drive the change.
And we've got to remember we're relating all this back to this accumulation of poverty and gender inequality in retirement for women. That's why the issues of women in parliament, women in the workforce in higher positions, salaries, because the outcomes for women in retirement can be really dire, but maybe only if they're single or have been divorced or no. I wanted to ask Raphael, because this interests me, because whenever I raise this question about unequal superannuation for women and all this stuff, men often say, well, but they're married, they'll get their husband super, and men are rich, and this is fine, and most people stay married into their... But you had a slide up, Raphael, that was talking about separation and divorce and stuff, and I wonder if you can just tell me about women who are not
in these happy, 45-year partnerships all through the, into retirement.
Well, I mean, in terms of the examples that I gave, the breakdown and the difference between the baseline male and going down to the woman who's had the long career breaks and is earning much less, that would be her retirement income. So her income, if she was married to the male who's the baseline, would be overall higher. But if she's by herself, then she just would be relying on that income that she's accumulated plus the age pension. Now, it might be worth also saying that if she got divorced, then in the breakup, she would get a proportion of the assets, and courts tend to recognise superannuation as part of the asset. But I wonder whether it depends on when the divorce takes place and whether the male then continues on a trajectory of accumulating assets, whereas the female is there stuck in a position where she finds it much more difficult to enter the labour market to the same extent, where she's missed out on those years of career growth that otherwise would be there.
But I thought you also had something that showed increasing divorce rates in later life or something.
That's right. I
thought there was...
So I'll give you a stat, which is in 1947, 1% of women at 60 to 64 were entering retirement divorced. 1947. Now, in 2011, that was 16%. So that's a much higher rate of women who are entering.
And that doesn't include all the women who were never married and all lived in, and had partnerships. But so, I guess my point, is that it's an increasing number of women who are having to fend for themselves in retirement and may not have the benefit of that husband super or the combined income. But were you wanting to?
I must say I'm rather disappointed with today in that we've had an enormous amount of commentary about process and very little commentary about, well, one speaker, certainly Felicity, talked about the need for systemic change. And I have to say my disappointment stretches to the Minister, because it's all very well to tell us what the data is. We know, actually. And I think that it's high time that we as activists put pressure back on for an increase in funding for social housing. I mean, we actually know what the solutions are. The data is pointing to a catastrophe, and I think it behoves us as activists to push governments again, both at the state and federal level and at the local level in terms of planning approvals, etc., to push for affordable housing, because I think the bottom line is, in terms of the whole topic of women, work and care, is it gets back down to affordable housing. Thanks.
Yes, please.
So, absolutely, I think we need to do that. But I think we also need to think through the tactics of how we do it. And one of the real problems is any relatively small group of people who is largely already fairly disadvantaged has very little political ability to influence things. And that's why we've seen New Start, what's happened to New Start, what's happened to young unemployed people happening in this budget, what happened to single parent payments under Labor, what's happening to disability support payments, and what's happened to social housing. And I think we need to think very carefully about how we build a political coalition that is big enough and powerful enough to get any change. And that has to include quite a lot of middle class people. Right? That's how you win things politically. And I actually think the biggest opening for that we should be thinking about now, we have the worst, pretty much, private rental rules in the world. So all those people who are in private rental are slumping into poverty, not just because the pension is linked to owning your own home, but also because private rental is so horrific, so that someone can come and say, well, I'm going to increase your rent by 15% if you say no, I'll evict you, and that's just grounds, effectively, to evict you. It's absolutely ridiculous. Now, there is a big middle-class constituency of people who want better rent rights. Right? There's heaps and heaps of people who are 30 and 35 who are professionals. And I think we need to be attacking this from lots of different angles, but they need to be building a coalition that's bigger. And I think that means we need to be finding things which help quite a lot of not that poor people. And that's, I think, also a challenge for a lot of people in progressive politics sometimes, is how we find those solidarities that will allow us to be able to win.
And is that possible when so many baby boomer people own their second and third houses and would maybe fight to the death against negative changes to negative gearing, even though they think that they personally might be able to help their child or children, maybe not if they've got three, even they're stretched then, but to hell with the rest, as long as they can hold on to those. How do you build a coalition of middle class when so many older middle class people are beneficiaries of the current system?
Look, I agree that's a challenge. The Sydney Alliance is doing some work specifically on that at the moment, so one of the groups that some people probably have heard of, where they identified exactly that problem. And so the first part of their campaign has been to go to those middle class baby boomers and to try to get them on board. And they actually found surprising support when it was framed in the sense of how do we support the next generation of people, how can we do this in a way that doesn't jeopardise your own retirement savings. And it certainly has to be predicated on particularly a lot of women who have used investment housing as a way of supplementing their super. So I think we have to think about it creatively, but I don't think it's impossible to do that if we try to do it in a systematic way.
I'm just wondering, before going on, whether anyone else on the panel in reply to the last questioner, has anything to say about working towards policy? In a sense, we do know a lot of these issues, and how you do get change.
I'm not sure how you necessarily work towards the policy or building the coalition, but one of the things that strikes me is that sometimes the political debate links certain issues to strangely to other issues. So the example that I gave was the low-income superannuation contribution was linked by Labour to the mining tax or the carbon tax, which meant that when coalition came in, they said, well, that's linked to the carbon tax which we're abolishing, which is why we're going to tax lower-income people higher rates for their superannuation contributions, which I just don't understand how you can link those two politically like that when the objectives are just so very different, rather than thinking about the budget overall. And that's one of the things that I find strange a little bit about the political debate around issues like that.
This in the second row here.
Sorry, can I just say something there, Adele?
Sorry, please.
Yes. Just want to add a comment, and I know this is something you're familiar with because I know you did a story a few years ago about a homeless fellow who had died and had been long-term homeless in the inner city, and one of the arguments that's been quite successful in other countries, it's had limited success here, is the notion that it actually costs us as a community a lot more to keep servicing homelessness than to actually solve it, because anyone who's in a housing crisis or who is homeless needs to have their needs met through expensive emergency services and also roaming through the system. If you can't get out of that system, there's no point having a homelessness response system. If at the end of it there's no house, you're just going to keep roaming through it. It is expensive to have that kind of response and not a permanent solution. Unfortunately, that economic argument has gained very little traction here in Australia, and I suspect it's because the way we've got the division between the federal and state and local in relation to the services they provide, because at the moment Housing New South Wales has to spend a lot of money, and the police and the health budgets and everything may well benefit from that, but not the housing budget. So we're too siloed. So I guess I was just adding that as another kind of argument to piggyback on.
So can I also make a point, Adele?
So
I think that solving the affordable housing crisis in Australia is certainly one of the big issues, but I think we shouldn't also lose sight of the fact that this is a broader problem, and we can't lose sight of the gender equity piece and actually supporting women in working and participating in work throughout their career cycles. And I think obviously as an organisation we recognise we can't solve this on our own. We need broader and sensible government policy. We need sensible community involvement. But I think that one of the things that I will make an observation very quickly that I am pleased that I'm seeing is that younger generations of women are much more financially savvy, and this I think is in no doubt to the great work that we've been doing for a long time around financial literacy. And some of the research that we've done as an organisation shows that there is actually more home ownership, and I don't know whether you guys can support this in any of your research. There is actually more home ownership in younger women than there is younger men currently. So I do see some positive signs, and I do see that the hard yards that you've all been through is starting to pay off, not discounting that we still have a major issue in the country, but I just wanted to make that point.
Good morning. My name's Arani Sant and I'm a carer. I've been a sole carer for 23 years for my son who's got a disability. And he's 23 and becoming more independent. I was a financier and worked for the World Bank, and my career was greatly affected by my caring role. But saying all that, I'm a very strong carer advocate on the Mental Health Council of Australia and Carers Net New South Wales. And I'm really excited about everything I heard this morning, especially about the caring credits idea. And I think I was interviewed for that, you know, effect on. That's nice to see. It's in print. But I specifically, I just wanted to make a contribution, Felicity, to your idea for, you know, some, because I've also gone quite a lot to Shelter New South Wales workshops and things like that. But in terms of housing, and when you asked earlier, did anyone have any ideas? Because I'm quite really involved with the NDIS and what's going to be happening there. But I really think one solution is a sort of housing register where we have, you know how you have this mate-to-mate here from COTA, but something on a bit like Airbnb. It's on the internet, and you can rent out a room to just travellers and things. And so if you've got a house anywhere in Australia and you want to have a flatmate or share the house, either with people with a disability, sort of a shared housing model, but also older people sharing houses together. And I'm now 55 in 2 weeks' time. But
I'm too messy and they don't want to live with me. So anyway, that's just a really concrete idea, and I think it's something that could be really doable. I'm also, I suppose, really excited about developing new social capital bonds and new means of financing.
They say I'm too messy and they don't want to live with me. So anyway, that's just a really concrete idea, and I think it's something that could be really doable. I'm also, I suppose, really excited about developing new
that's just a statistic that we know, and that's because they end up having 70% of the caring role of the children, so they work less and stuff.
And then I just want to say,
coming at
women's earning capacity goes down by 30% post-divorce, and I think that's just a statistic that we know, and that's because they end up having 70% of the caring role of the children. So
certainly the register idea has come up before, and I think that's a great idea for those that want to do that. But it reminds me of something that I didn't tell you guys because it wasn't appropriate to this presentation, that often homelessness is really misunderstood. People always during depression times go, oh, we're going to have so many homeless people. It's quite the opposite. Homelessness goes up in boom times. Because people with the means spread out, and you only need to look at a mining town. Just try and rent somewhere in a mining town in any place in Australia, and all the locals have been completely priced out of it. And so this idea that actually what we've got now is a systemic growing inequality between the housing haves and the housing have-nots. And the idea of sharing that is great, but it maybe have a limited audience. But I think you're right.
I'll just weigh in on, I think the point that you raise about the technology-based solution for housing is really fascinating, and I won't really weigh in on it from a housing perspective because it's not my area of expertise, but really, some of the questions here around can we be positive and where can we really create change, and I think it is by being innovative and taking a different approach. And it's not just about women coming up with solutions for women and women's issues, it's actually seeing the societal issue and looking at completely different solutions, bringing completely different people to the table. So I'd love to throw that challenge to fish burners or to an entrepreneurial innovation lab where you say to some people, think about how you would solve the problem of the fact that there's so many amazing and talented workers who are going to be exiting the workforce, and how can we create some technology-based solution to ensure that we can tap into that expertise. The same with people who are looking for part-time work. It's really, really hard to find part-time work in many instances. So again, you'd be wanting to look at what's an innovative technology-based solution that, like an eBay for part-time workers, for instance, where you can bring different people to an employer need. So there's a lot of different ways that we need to start thinking about this problem, and we need to bring different people to this challenge that haven't ordinarily weighed in on solving these issues.
I guess, though, in the end, a bit what we should all keep in mind what Felicity said, that for all these innovative and solutions and so on, they may be just working on the edges, because you don't really need more caseworkers. You actually need more housing, more affordable housing, and in the end, that's the crux of it. And I think we've kind of, what Helen Laurent said earlier, who's been in this area for years, has affordable housing is the crux. We kind of know that. We just have to find a way to get more of it. And there are all these policy levers that could be pulled to make that a bit easier. I don't know, I'm making a little spiel here, it should, because it's time to be we're finishing? One more minute? So I don't know whether someone else, then, if you want to comment on comment on whether in the end it is for women caring and housing, whether women work and care, whether the foundation of affordable housing is crucial and whether we still have to work towards that.
Oh, look, absolutely, and I think that just hits it's a political problem, and it's, as Howard said, he never lost an election because house prices are going up. And that's really the crux of it, right? If house prices keep on going up, less people will be able to afford them. You have to create some elaborate dual system to be able to then cater for everyone else, and that is a real political challenge.
Okay. We have one last question, I think.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. I take your point, most of you, and that you have a very long-term vision, and you're looking after the workers of now so that they're not homeless in the future. And yes, as the conversation is coming round now to the here and now of the unaffordable housing and the homeless, and I think there are a lot of groups that we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about the women who get kicked out of the refuge after 6 months. We haven't talked about the generations in the one family where they're unemployed. We haven't talked about the casualisation of the workforce and the inability, the hidden unemployment, like
and that
1 hour a week.
superannuation goes down when you're unemployed.
Yeah. So I was put in mind in the reading The Good Weekend of the Meriton story, and thought if only we could tithe someone like Triggerboff for 1 unit in every block that he builds, we almost wouldn't have a homeless. So it's I think it's the sector that is making a lot of money out of housing that we possibly have to look at in terms of helping to provide for those who haven't. And we need to do something like that now.
Thank you. That's a great point.
It's my delightful duty to close this conference and to thank everybody for their contributions and for their attendance. First of all, I want to, on behalf of COTA New South Wales, and COTA stands for Council on the Ageing. I heard a question being asked at morning tea. So we're the Council on the Ageing for New South Wales, and I want to thank the Minister for sponsoring today's forum and allowing us and facilitating us being able to canvass this very important subject in the State Parliament House. And as one of the questioners highlighted, we are all citizens and we have to take a strong stand on these issues, which this morning I hope has encouraged and energised a number of us to do so. For the speakers, thank you very much for your contribution. I got so much out of it myself, and from the questions that have come at the end of the session, it's obvious that you've really inspired and provided us with a great deal of knowledge and insight. Ben was a aha moment for me, the way he identified the structural, systematic way that we've put together income and family income over the decades since the Harvester Agreement was very insightful, and how this disadvantage has been working out as we transition from older social contracts to new styles of family and work, and particularly for the way that women have been marginalised both in the income and career and superannuation and pensions. And thank you, Ben, for that presentation. Felicity presented the findings of the report that was sponsored by the Mercy Foundation of Dr. Marie Patterson's, and I found that the insight that homelessness is conventional, but Felicity's very strong point that she challenged us that homelessness is not a pathology. It's not the result of individual. There is not good homeless, which is middle class homeless, and bad homeless, which is those sleeping rough. And the Dr. Marie Patterson's report is a seminal report, as Felicity highlighted. There has been very little in the literature that has studied this issue. Heidi, presenting from the on the gender equality in the workplace, really struck a point for me when she said that Australia is the #1 for female education equality, but 52nd in the world in the workplace. Heidi highlighted that some of the structural issues that have to be undertaken both legislatively and in the workplace to overcome that inequality, and really emphasised the point that gender equality in the workplace is good for business, and nicely followed by Jane, who just showed how good for business it is. Jane's highlighting flexibility, how there's got to be the hard wire and the soft wire. Simple things. I know in my own workplace, we allocated all the best parking spots to parents of young children. And that was the basis that the best parking spots went to, because they've got to rush from school, dropping children off to school, and they've got to rush home again. So we gave them the best parking spots. So flexibility, much more significant flexibility than parking spots. So the Investing in Care report that Alison very succinctly summarised in the 6 strategies, from the point that carers collectively have the worst well-being of any group in Australia, is a point that we should take away from this conference, and that we should be thinking legislatively. And there's only a minor glimmer of hope that the taxation review later in the year might include such radical ideas as carer credits, but I doubt that very much. Raphael, like Ben before him, has given us some very insightful data analysis of the interaction between the superannuation, the income replacement streams of retirement income, and the pension streams of retirement income. And I have to say for myself, it was a very sobering moment that Raphael's analysis of just how the budget that is being proposed in the federal parliament has really damaged the equality mechanisms between those 2 pillars. I thought the budget had done enough damage when it had cut the significant cuts to the National Rental Affordability Scheme. You know, under that scheme, where 14,000 dwellings have been completed, and there are 24,000 additional homes in the pipeline in the country. But stage 5 of that scheme will no longer proceed according to the budget. Similarly, the Housing Help for Seniors pilot program, which has a budget of $173 million, has been abolished. And the budget also saw a $44 million cut to homelessness services. So when we combine those cuts with Raphael's analysis, I can appreciate Ben's call to action and the need to get the middle class involved in the political solutions. One of the highlights years and years ago when discussing the creation of Medicare, one of the principles in Medicare was the principle of monopsonistic purchasing, which is a fancy way of saying have the sharp elbows of the middle class involved in the receipt and delivery of services, and that's the only way you ensure in a democracy like ours that will actually work. So as Ben highlighted, we need to get the sharp elbows of the middle class involved in the issues that have been highlighted this morning. And finally, a thank you to Adele for facilitating our session at the end. You know, I'm one of the dwindling subscribers to the Sydney Morning Herald, and the paper is poorer for many reasons, but one it's poorer for is the loss of Adele's column. So thank you for your participation in our forum. I hope you will join us again in the future. And I'll leave you with a quote that I wrote down from Alison's comments. In the future, we do not want any woman to retire in poverty because they chose to care. Thank you.